What's up everybody, this is Master Ian Gamer, and we just got a brand new Overwatch PTR patch with a ton of fantastic changes, many of which are very clearly focused at lowering the power of the current double barrier meta. So today I wanted to take a look at some of these hero changes, specifically the ones for the tanks, and give my thoughts about how I think these are going to affect the different tank heroes, how it might result in different tank heroes becoming a bit more viable, seeing a bit of a change in who's getting played, since after all I am a tank main, and tanks are, I guess, my area of expertise. So instead of focusing on all the hero changes, many of which are for characters that I don't even really play that much, I wanted to just focus on the tanks and give my thoughts about how I think these are gonna play out. So without further ado, let's jump right on in. First up, D.Va's Defense Matrix buff. Regeneration rate increased from 12.5% to 16% per second, with the delay before regeneration being lowered from 1 second to 0.75 seconds. This is fantastic. D.Va really needed this because, well, she's kind of sucked lately. I mean, I guess D.Va has been a meta pick for basically forever, at least the vast majority of Overwatch's lifetime so far, and it was only recently after she had all her defense matrix nerfs that she kind of fell out of the meta, but she did sort of fall into one of those positions where, well, she just couldn't really do anything. She was hit pretty hard with the 2-2-2 roll queue implementation, and overall just couldn't really find a good spot. So honestly, I think these defense matrix buffs are amazing, and are definitely going to help her out. Will they be enough to bring her back into reasonable viability? Probably, if we're being honest. Defense matrix is a powerful ability, but we're going to really have to wait and see. The next change to look at is Roadhog. Scrap gun ammunition increased from 5 to 6. This is plain and simply done as a barrier counter. This is basically the only reason they've given him this buff, and honestly, countering barriers is probably the only impact this is going to end up having. It allows him to just deal out a bit more damage, especially in the narrow windows of opportunity when you're trying to burst down a Sigma or Orisa barrier, and outside of that, having one extra ammo shot isn't really going to change much, to be honest. So I just think it's funny how simple and clearly designed this change for him was, but I gotta say, I think it's definitely called for. It'll help Roadhog to be a bit more viable in, once again, a meta where he just hasn't really had a decent place. Next we have Winston. Barrier projector duration increased from 6 to 9 seconds, and health increased from 600 to 700. A bit unexpected, but I kind of see the direction that Blizzard is going for here. I have to say, it is kind of a bit odd to see a barrier buff in a meta where barriers are already so commonplace and problematic, but at the same time, it is Winston, who doesn't really have much room to work in the current meta. Plain and simply, it seems like this buff was given to him just to make his barrier more competitive with the other barrier tanks, which I find kind of interesting because it seems to indicate that Blizzard isn't looking to tone back down all the barriers that currently exist in the game back to some sort of non-mandatory level like what we saw kind of in the early days, but rather to more or less leave the barriers as they are, and instead just bring all the barrier tanks more in line with each other, thus, I guess, giving more room for the different barrier tanks to be played instead of having only one or two that work in any given scenario. And now getting onto the two most significant tank changes, the ones to the meta players themselves, Orisa and Sigma. Starting with Orisa, protective barrier cooldown increased from 9 to 10 seconds. Oh boy, this is going to hurt. It was a pretty tangible change when she had the nerf from 8 seconds to 9 seconds a little while ago to sort of, make her less powerful. 9 seconds to 10 seconds? Ooh, this is gonna be scary. At the same time though, I definitely wouldn't say that it's uncalled for. Like, I definitely agree that this is probably the direction Blizzard should be taking the hero, since it's in line with the idea of Orisa being a character whose barrier is highly immobile. By increasing the cooldown for it, it reduces how often you can can relocate it, and thus forces her to play in more strictly bunker comps, and she becomes less versatile, I guess you could say. Additionally, this is also going to have a much bigger impact on the lower ranked players who play Orisa as opposed to the higher ranked players, since at the lower ranks you're more likely to misplace your barrier or put it down in the wrong place, put it down at the wrong time, whereas at the higher ranks you're going to know the right time and place to put it every time, thus the extra second cooldown is going to be less impactful for people on the higher skill ranks. While I do agree that this change was probably necessary and will in the long run probably be for the best, I can't help but wonder if this is just going to result in another shift where Reinhardt suddenly becomes the meta barrier tank and Orisa slips back into obscurity. Basically, ever since Orisa was added to the game, there's been this back and forth. Reinhardt's better, then Orisa's better, then Reinhardt's better, then Orisa's better. Each time, one is used 99% of the time, and the other one is kind of garbage in comparison. I am a bit worried it's just gonna swing back to Reinhardt, which I guess personally doesn't really matter that much for me, since I play both of them and honestly I enjoy both. So ideally we'd get a world where both heroes work well together, but historically that's just not really been the case, and I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes out to see if that ends up happening again here with this Orisa nerf, because to be honest, I could really easily see it end up happening. And moving on to the final tank, we got Sigma with a few different changes, of which I have mixed opinions. So first up, Kinetic Grasp no longer blocks Chain Hook and Whip Shot. This is great. This is technically a nerf to Sigma, only a fairly small nerf, all things considered, but I love this just because of the consistency of it. I get why the hook and the whip shot were absorbed, I guess, although not really, by Sigma's Kinetic Grasp, but it just felt so inconsistent with all the other abilities along those lines. Like, D.Va's Defense Matrix doesn't absorb them, so why does Kinetic Grasp? But then at the same time, Sigma's own Accretion, which could kind of be classified along the same lines as Whip Shot and Hook, wasn't absorbed by Kinetic Grasp. It was just a mess, and I didn't like how inconsistent it was, so I am glad that they finally just sort of put it more in line with what seems just more intuitive. Next up though, Gravitic Flux High Gravity Effect Duration reduced from 1.2 to 0.9 seconds. This is, again, just another slight nerf, not one that I think he really needed, to be honest. Basically, this just means after he raises them up and slams them back into the ground, there's a bit of a sort of high gravity effect, where the enemies who were just hit by Gravitic Flux are slowed, and now that's been reduced by 0.3 seconds. Not too big of a nerf, to be honest, won't have too much of an impact, I don't think, but I don't know, I don't really feel like he needed that, although this is probably a change that I'm just going to have to see how it plays out and see how I get a feel for it after playing him a bit on the PTR. And Experimental Barrier, regeneration rate reduced from 175 to 150 per second, now has a 1 second cooldown after recalling the barrier, initial 0.2 second cast time removed. Let's start with the last one of these, the removal of the 0.2 second cast time. Oh my god, this feels so good. I always hated that delay he has, because it just made him feel clunky. The smoothness of just being able to send out the barrier as you needed it, I just felt interrupted by this stupid delay that I never liked. And now that they're removing it, despite the 1 second cooldown after recalling the barrier, I think he actually feels a lot more fluid to actually play in this regard. You can send out his barrier when you want to send out his barrier. Sure, the cooldown is going to delay how frequently you can actually send it out, but that's just going to become another cooldown management aspect. You won't get that clunky feeling of pressing the barrier button and having to wait for the barrier to actually move out. So while this is technically a nerf in terms of recalling and summoning the barrier, I actually really like it, and I think it's going to make him feel at least more fluid and better to play. The shield regeneration nerf is, for me, a lot like the Gravitic Flux, where it's going to be a fairly minor change. I think this one is going to be more noticeable than Gravitic Flux's nerf, but I don't feel like it was particularly necessary. Looking at the double barrier meta, a lot of it I do think is Orisa's issues and the issue of her barrier being too prominent and Sigma sort of just having the benefit of synergizing well with Orisa. So I don't really like how many nerfs Sigma is getting in this patch. Again, some of them feel justified and fair, but this one in particular, I'm gonna just have to see how I feel about it as time goes on. For the time being, I definitely don't think it's necessary, but it might just take a bit of time to tell and see how things play out. As for how all these changes are going to end up impacting the double barrier meta, well, I think it's safe to say that these won't kill the meta outright. The changes, while really good pretty much all across the board, aren't going to have a strong enough impact to suddenly bring up some completely different brand new meta. At least I don't think so. I do, however, think that these will for sure reduce the power of double barrier, which is actually going to have a noticeable impact on the vast majority of the player base. When you consider that the meta really only applies to the very top tiny percent of all the player base, and the majority of players can kind of get away with playing whatever they want, more or less, in most situations, I think these changes are just going to make it so that the impact of the double barrier meta is going to be pushed higher up the skill tier. Basically, if you're in the middle 90% of players, these changes are pretty much just going to give you more room to actually play other heroes without the quote-unquote meta really shifting that much. Even before this patch, I still very frequently see non-double barrier tank comps being run, and to be honest, they can work pretty well in most skill tiers. So having these changes that are on the PTR currently is just going to take a little bit more power away from double barrier, not remove it outright, which I think is a fair way to handle a meta that people want to change. You don't need to outright kill it or the heroes who are propping it up, but rather just shift some power away to give the players more freedom to try out other things. Anyways, these have been my thoughts on the new tank changes in the latest PTR patch, as well as how they're going to impact the meta. Let me know your thoughts by leaving a comment down below. Do you think these changes are overall for the best? And do you think that it might actually have a much bigger impact on the meta than I currently think? Either way, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and share it with a friend if you really liked it. Subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and hit up the bell to never miss any of my future Overwatch content. This is Master Gamer signing off, and until next time, have a great day.